Welcome to Mystic Realms Recap. Links are in the description below. Please show some love of the author and me. On to the show.
Since Hoffman could reveal such an incredible piece of news, it probably meant that the team had discovered something. A look of insuppressible excitement flashed in Hoffman's eyes, and he nodded. Yes, the expedition team delved deep into Lockdammer, and spent about half a year exploring while following the clues. They even lost contact with us for a while. At last, they finally ended up in the huge canyon of Gargus, and made an amazing discovery. To be honest, if he didn't know that Hoffman would never lie to him, Lin Li would have a hard time believing such a ridiculous thing. The conditions in Lockdammer were already considered to be rather harsh and unreal, and those in the huge canyon of Gargus, that Hoffman mentioned, were extremely terrible. If the High Elves hated the environment in Lockdammer, they would definitely detest that of Gargus. In the language of the dwarves, Gargus meant insurmountable, and the huge canyon of Gargus was indeed almost insurmountable. The huge canyon stretched across thousands of miles, and the cliffs on both sides were like swords and axes. They were covered in thick ice that had existed for thousands of years. The canyon was bottomless, and the darkness was daunting. The sounds of the wind howling miserably could be heard as if it was passing through the terrifying endless abyss. The huge canyon of Gargus divided the dwarf kingdom and the breezy plains into two different worlds, and there was almost no possibility of a linkage between the two. It was precisely because of its existence that almost all the trade between the breezy plains and the dwarf kingdom had to go through the leaden kingdom. That was perhaps also one of the reasons that most of the forces in the breezy plains had always refused to integrate into the felon kingdom. After all, if they really did that, the authorities of the leaden kingdom would definitely cause them to face many more obstacles. About 2 months ago, the expedition team that went to Lockdammer returned, but only 2 out of the 50 members of the team managed to survive. However, the casualties weren't in vain. After all, we discovered an amazing secret from the items that they brought back. In the huge canyon of Gargus, there is very likely to be a ruin of the High Elves that is far larger in scale than any that we have ever unearthed. Hoffman's eyes glistened, and he could not suppress the excitement at all. A team of 50 was sent to explore a place based on seemingly absurd clues. That fact alone was enough to show that the Glitter Gold Trade Union was indeed enthusiastic about exploring the ruins. Those who could join the expedition were probably the most loyal to the Glitter Gold Trade Union. Given Hoffman's status, he wouldn't mention it to an ordinary person. At this moment, Lin Li could not help but get really interested after seeing the look of excitement on Hoffman's face. He asked, "Master Hoffman, could you tell me about the amazing discovery?" "Haha, Master Flick, you're reading too much into things. Since I want to invite you to a cooperation, I naturally have to come up with something that you can believe." While speaking, Hoffman took out some items and placed them on the table one by one. There were some stones and a few loose pieces of metal accessories, which didn't seem to have anything peculiar about them. However, Lin Li took a closer look and saw that some of the stones were carved with patterns, while some had characters of the High Elves' language carved on them. The metal accessories were also exuding faint magical waves, while the patterns on them seemed to be a part of superior mageths. Lin Li didn't research much on archaeology, but he could tell that those inconspicuous things indeed belonged to the High Elves. Although the mageths on the metal accessories could be drawn by the existing masters of inscription, drawing on such small pieces of accessories could perhaps only be done by top jewelers. However, jewelers were almost extinct in the breezy plains. Lin Li had never heard of any famous jewelers, let alone one of the master level. These things do seem to belong to the High Elves. However, how did you deduce the scale of the ruins? Lin Li asked, believing that Hoffman wouldn't deceive him. Hence, the items of the High Elves should have been able to prove that the High Elves had appeared in the huge canyon of Gargus before. However, Lin Li couldn't help but pay attention to the scale of the ruins. After all, there would be no point in going to places like the huge canyon of Gargus unless one was motivated by something. Lin Li looked at it from a technical point of view, while Hoffman relied on his historical knowledge and years of experience in excavating the ruins of the High Elves. After taking out those items, Hoffman took out another drawing of an exquisite accessory. He then placed the pieces of metal onto the corresponding positions of the design and explained to Lin Li, "Master Flick, please look at the sketch of this accessory, which we found in one of the High Elves' ruins that we had unearthed. It's said that the accessory is meant for the High Elves. Can you see anything from these pieces?" Lin Li leaned forward curiously and took a closer look at the sketch and the pieces of metal on it. He could not help but be shocked. The drawing on the sketch was definitely larger than the actual object, but Lin Li could accurately tell that the pieces of metal were part of the accessory just by looking at the mageths on them. Lin Li made some judgments about whether the accessory was meant for the High Elves after he looked at the structure of the entire mageth on the sketch. The mageth was a Guru level 1, that had the function of creating a domain that would cancel invisibility. No assassins would be able to escape the domain unless they were at the sanctuary level. Another function was to provide a user with greater protection. Even if the enemy's attacks were beyond the tolerance of the mage, it would still allow the user to resist the attacks, and there was almost no upper limit. However, what really attracted the High Elves were not those two incredible functions, but the fact that the user's body would be enveloped in a colorful and brilliant glow. Once the sacred Mageth was activated, it would allow the user to exude a sacred aura that resembled that of a god during its ascent on Earth. That was also the reason that the sacred Mageth could only be used by the royals of the High Elves dynasty. Even the High Lord Osric, who was second to the High Elven Queen, was not qualified to use sacred protection Mageth anywhere. Hence, Lin Li was sure that the High Elves' relics that appeared in the ruins which the Glitter Gold Trade Union had excavated were likely to belong to a High Elven royal family, simply because of the sacred Mageth. In the past few years that Lin Li had been in Anril, he explored the Sky Castle, Osric's mausoleum, and the underground palace. Every treasure that he found was rather significant, hence, ordinary ruins wouldn't attract him. However, the incredible relics of the royal High Elves were different. They were considered the nobles among the High Elven aristocrats. Even if they were not famous in history, they were far wealthier than other High Elven aristocrats since they were royals. Unlike humans, the lineage of the High Elves determined the lives that they were destined to live. With greater talents and more resources, they had a far more advantageous position than ordinary nobles in all aspects, and the relics that they had left behind were naturally destined to be extraordinary. At the thought of this, Lin Li couldn't help but feel a little excited. Staring at the drawings and the pieces of metals on the table, he said, "If this is really a relic of the royal High Elves, it will really be an unprecedented discovery." Yes, this is exactly what I want to say, but no matter which High Elven royal family this relic belongs to, obtaining it definitely will be difficult. Hence, considering that you have explored the Sky Castle and Osric's mausoleum, I hope to cooperate with you in exploring and unearthing the ruin, Hoffman said while looking at Lin Li with anticipation in his eyes as he waited for his answer. If it were an ordinary relic, there would be no need for the Glitter Gold Trade Union to share it with anyone or engage in cooperation with their current power. However, Hoffman had no choice but to take it seriously, because it might really be a relic of the High Elven royal family. The Glitter Gold Trade Union prospered and rose through exploring and excavating ruins. It was the most important for them to be aware of their own abilities, not to be muddled up because of the huge temptation. Although wealth would usually be found in dangerous situations, how many could really survive close shaves with death and become wealthy? Perhaps that could happen once or twice, but Lady Luck would not always shine on them. If anything were to go wrong, they would end up losing everything. Lin Li leaned back against the chair and looked away from the table while tapping his fingers gently on the armrest. After all, it was a relic of the High Elven royal family, and it would be impossible for Lin Li not to be tempted. Seeing that the catastrophe predicted by Garesco was just round the corner, he thought, is it really worthwhile to spend some time and energy on this? After a moment of thought, Lin Li finally turned to look at Hoffman with a smile. Since you've shared this piece of information with me, what reason do I have to refuse? Hearing that Lin Li had finally agreed, Hoffman couldn't help but feel relieved. He continued, in that case, Master Felix, should we talk about the specifics of our cooperation? Although there were plenty of forces in the breezy plains that would be worthy of cooperating with the Glitter Gold Trade Union, Lin Li and the Tower of Dusk were the only ones Hoffman could trust. In this world where survival of the fittest was the rule, those who trusted others easily would often end up dying a horrible death. As the president of the Glitter Gold Trade Union, Hoffman obviously knew the truth. The temptation of the High Elves' ruins was too great, and it also meant that the crisis they might face would absolutely be beyond imagination. An incompetent partner would not help at all. Meanwhile, if they were to look for a partner like the Mithril Alliance, they would have to be wary and keep their guard up against the latter during the exploration. Lin Li was different. Be it the Malfa family he had cooperated with in exploring the Sky Castle before, or the Alana Guild of Magic that he had explored Osric's mausoleum with, Hoffman knew them well, and was aware that they were reliable allies. Although Lin Li had got into a conflict with the Dark Blade, and caused the legendary assassin Lansdale and Stephen to die in the process of exploring the Sky Castle, Hoffman knew what had actually happened. He also knew that Lin Li had helped the Elven Elders when they were evacuating. Hence, in Hoffman's eyes, Lin Li was the most trustworthy partner to have in the entire Anril. Now that the two had decided to cooperate, they naturally discussed the distribution of benefits first. A reliable cooperation could only be formed when there was a fair distribution of benefits and interests. Regardless of the friendship between both parties, The issue of distribution of benefits had to be discussed clearly in advance. Due to the importance of the matter, Hoffman and Lin Li decided to discuss it with each other instead of leaving it to their subordinates. Actually, there wasn't much to talk about. First, they had to decide on the amount of effort both parties had to put in during the exploration. Everyone knew that it would be impossible to distribute in detail all the items in the ruins. Besides, there might be nothing at all. Hence, they only briefly talked about how they would divide the items. It didn't take long for the two to reach an agreement. First of all, they agreed on the amount of effort they would each put in after estimating the scale of the ruins. They also agreed to distribute the interests and gains evenly. No matter what they obtained, they would share the profits with each other. That was the rule of distribution. Actually, Hoffman could be considered to have made some compromise. After all, they agreed to put in equal amounts of effort, but the Glitter Gold Trade Union was the one who'd discovered the clues leading to the relics. If he were to be calculative about it, it would be reasonable for him to ask for an additional 10%. Of course, Hoffman's compromise did not actually mean that he had really suffered a loss. First of all, it would not be easy to look for a trustworthy collaborator in this intriguing world. After all, anything could happen in the ruins, and it was not uncommon for groups and alliances to break up because of trust issues. In addition, the power that Lin Li promised to give was not superficial. Lin Li alone was an extraordinary level 24 powerhouse, and he also had various trump cards like the Debris of the Stars, the Young Elemental Wyrm, the Lord of Nightmares, and many others. After discussing the cooperation, Hoffman put away the items and continued to chat with Lin Li about the situation in the Breezy Plains, as well as other issues. In particular, Hoffman was rather emotional when he talked about the events that happened in Grand Town the other day. He had not expected the Ashen Warlock, who had been living in Grand Town for thousands of years and was a god in Anral, to be impressed with Lin Li and the Tower of Dusk. However, Hoffman did not recklessly ask about the conversation from when the Ashen Warlock invited Lin Li to the Tower of Ashes. Instead, he suddenly mentioned to Lin Li the Blood Moon clan, and Mogadi who carried the bloodline of a Wyrm. Masterfully, after the Ashen Warlock invited you to the Tower of Ashes, Mogadi, the president of the Blood Moon clan, looked for me and spoke to me about something. He mainly explained to me the reason he joined the Mithril Alliance, Hoffman said while looking at Lin Li's face and paying attention to his expression with his gleaming small eyes. The Blood Moon clan, Mithril Alliance, and the Caesar family, which were the three major clans in the Breezy Plains, jointly asked the Ashen Warlock to expel Lin Li and the Tower of Dusk from the land. Although they did not succeed because of the unexpected words of the Ashen Warlock, they had clearly shown their enmity towards the Tower of Dusk. However, when Hoffman mentioned the Blood Moon clan, Lin Li did not have any special expression on his face, and instead asked for the reason, which was what Hoffman hoped for. Oh, why? Seeing that there was no look of annoyance on Lin Li's face, Hoffman felt somewhat relieved, and he continued, Master Flick, I'm sure you know the origin of the Blood Moon clan. Their core members are all hybrids that had been modified using blood mixing techniques by the High Elves. The current president, Mogadi, is a human whose blood had been mixed with that of Wyrms. Although the mixing of blood had given them incredible power, there were inevitable side effects that would cause them to feel some pain from the backlash of the blood every now and then. Lin Li nodded and remained silent. In fact, he had already anticipated such problems ever since he heard about the origin of the Blood Moon clan. Mixing the blood of monsters with the blood of humans would create a warrior that was as powerful as a beast with the intelligence of humans. It seemed to be a simple idea, but it was definitely difficult to execute. Just like the method that Osric used to create the perfect body, and the method that the Immortal King used to create the Ashen Warlock, the blood-mixing technique was also a forbidden one that violated nature. The High Elves were undoubtedly out of their minds as they were willing to do anything crazy. Bloodlines were the foundation for the continuation of species. It was the best choice made by nature after countless years of natural selection, where only the fittest would survive. The remaining bloodlines might not be the most perfect, but they were definitely the most balanced. Like a scale of precision, the High Elves' blood-mixing techniques were undoubtedly going to break the balance. It was only right for them to be punished by the laws of nature. Originally, they could be suppressed by a medicine provided by the High Elves. However, after the High Elves were destroyed, they could only resist the pain with their own will. However, the Blood Moon clan had been established many years ago, and there were originally hundreds of core members. The weakest one was close to the legendary level. Even the successive battles with the Mithril Alliance did not cause any core members to die. However, under the torment that resulted from the backlash, many chose to end their own lives. While speaking, Hoffman shook his head and seemed to be emotional about it. Although the core members of the Blood Moon clan were victims of the forbidden technique, Lin Li did not have much sympathy for them. Compared to the backlash from the forbidden technique, the benefits that they had gained were far better. Their powerful strength and long lifespan made them much better than those who could not step into the legendary realm. Does this have anything to do with their cooperation with the Mithril Alliance? Lin Li asked monotonously without showing any sympathy or disgust. Well, the Blood Moon clan got the original formula for suppressing the pain from the backlash. However, a crucial type of serum grass is required by the formula. You too know that that type of serum grass is not found everywhere. Even if there are any, they're few and far between. Later on, the Blood Moon clan learned that there was serum grass growing in the swamps of the Tower of Dusk. They also found out that the environment there is very suitable for a large number of plantations. They decided to heed Joseph's advice and try to get the swamp mining area from you. Hoffman couldn't help but look at Lin Li's expression again. After all, the Blood Moon clan had offended the Tower of Dusk terribly in Grand Town, and not everyone could forgive things like that. Lin Li could tell that Hoffman was worried. Hence, he smiled nonchalantly and said, so that's why they wanted the serum grass. When I was in Grand Town, Mogadi contacted me, but they were pretty greedy. They wanted me to give them the entire area. You know too that swamp mining area contains a lot of rare magical metals that are simply priceless. Their request was no different from daylight robbery. Yes, they think of themselves as the extraordinary masters of the breezy plains. They're really annoying. You should have seen the interesting expressions on their faces when the Ashen Warlock invited you to the Tower of Ashes. At the thought of that scene that day, Hoffman couldn't help but laugh. Lin Li knew that Hoffman would not mention the Blood Moon clan for no reason. Seeing how careful Hoffman was, he finally couldn't help but say, Master Hoffman, based on our relationship, you can just say anything you want. Mogadi probably did not only explain to you the reason for their cooperation with the Mithril Alliance, but also something else. Hoffman shook his head helplessly and explained, don't get me wrong, I am not Mogadi's messenger. I merely agreed to be the middleman in hopes of solving the conflict between you two because I'm a friend of the Tower of Dusk. After all, there is no unforgettable hatred, and the problem between you two can be resolved peacefully as well. Master Hoffman, don't worry, I understand your kind intentions. Lin Li nodded to express his understanding, but he soon continued, however, you also know that they're being too greedy. The swamp mining area is also very important to the Tower of Dusk. I won't sell it even if they give me money. Besides, I'm not belittling them now, but given the reserves that we've proven to have now, I doubt they might be able to afford it. Lin Li was not being perfunctory. Actually, he had long understood Hoffman's intentions. In fact, the swamp mining area was a massive treasure for the other forces, though it wouldn't be a loss for them even though it would be gratifying for them to get it. However, it had a different significance for the Blood Moon clan. It was the hope that the core members had for breaking free from the pain of the backlash from their blood. Other forces might fear the power of the Tower of Dusk or the powerful Ashen Warlock, and make a wise choice between massive wealth and their own lives. But the Blood Moon clan was different from them. The pain of the backlash from their blood had even made some of them choose to end their own lives to break free. Now that they had seen some hope of getting rid of the torment, how could they let go of it easily? If they truly felt hopeless, and didn't care about their lives anymore, they would definitely bring a lot of trouble to the Tower of Dusk, without any fear of the Ashen Warlock. After seeing that the Ashen Warlock values you, how can Mogadi dare to harbor those thoughts? This time, he means for you to share the method of planting serum grass. He hopes that you guys can help to dig out some serum grass, while mining in the swamp mining area. They will then purchase it from you, at a high price. Seeing that Lin Li had understood his intentions, Hoffman finally said the words that Mogadi had asked him to relay to Lin Li. This is a good thing. Anyway, we can't mine the entire area in one day. If I help him get some serum grass plants, I can strike a fortune. However, as far as I know, serum grass has harsh conditions for growth. Mining would inevitably affect the environment. Once the environment is ready for growing serum grass, what are they going to do? Planting herbs was no big deal, but Lin Li was puzzled as to why the Blood Moon clan decided to give up on that piece of land so soon. Well, that old man Mogadi said that they'll play by ear. I think that's the only solution. At least they can go for a long time, without suffering from the pain of the backlash from their bloodline. There is still time for them to consider other solutions. Seeing that Lin Li had agreed to that matter, Hoffman felt relieved. As for what would happen to the Blood Moon clan in the future, it wasn't up to him to worry about. He continued, since you agree, I'll give them an answer after we're done exploring the ruins. I'll get him to talk to you about the details. Okay, I'll have to trouble you then, Master Hoffman, Lin Li answered politely. Although he wouldn't necessarily be afraid of the Blood Moon clan given his current abilities, it would naturally be a good thing for him to have one less enemy and one more cooperative partner while protecting his interests. Lin Li was a guest at the Glitter Gold Trade Union for 3 days. After the negotiation between the two parties was settled and the cooperation agreement was signed, he said goodbye to Hoffman. He then returned to the Tower of Dusk together with Gavin, Beckley, and his 2 undead servants. Upon returning to the Tower of Dusk, Gavin and Beckley went to work separately and made some adjustments to their businesses in accordance with the agreement that they had signed. Lin Li returned to his usual routine of hustling all day, reading the Book of Eternity, comprehending the debris of the stars, and meditating under the monatides of the control crystal of the Sky Castle. Regarding the exploration of the ruins, Lin Li temporarily put it aside, mainly because the Glitter Gold Trade Union still had plenty of things to prepare. After all, they might be exploring the ruins of the High Elven Royals. It would be better to have redundant preparations than have inadequate resources when facing a crisis. Of course, it was impossible for the Tower of Dusk not to make any preparations. Although Lin Li had explored the Sky Castle and Ozric's mausoleum, and had also purified the Retribution Knight Rodheart, he did not belittle the exploration this time. The Gargus Canyon was a dangerous place, and it was probably a bit more dangerous than the Ga mountain range. The ruins of the High Elves made it even more dangerous. Not only did Lin Li not want to fail in the exploration, he also hoped not to suffer too many losses. Hence, while Lin Li continued to increase his abilities, and made the mages put aside everything that they were doing to devote their effort and attention to learning magic, Lin Li's various means were enough to make the magicians more powerful. Not to mention anything else, the control crystal of the Sky Castle alone could make the mages of the Tower of Dusk bask in the magic tides. Although it would not allow the mages to quickly enter the legendary realm, they could advance greatly when they were below the legendary level. Moreover, Lin Li also allowed the mages who had reached the peak of level 19 to enter the Eternal Furnace and feel the nomological power of ice and fire in the ice and fire nature magical domain. Even if they could only feel a tinge of the mystery of the laws, their strength could still be greatly improved. When Lin Li was concentrating on improving his strength, the Tower of Dusk did not completely quiet down. Although they had learned from the lessons of the George family, not everyone stopped opposing the Tower of Dusk. In fact, since the gathering in Grand Town, where the Ashen Warlock made a speech, the Tower of Dusk was no longer alienated by all the other forces in the breezy plains. Instead, they were boycotted by the Mithril Alliance and the forces that they controlled. The other forces would no longer go against the Tower of Dusk even if they did not suck up to them. However, unlike other forces, it was impossible for the Mithril Alliance to stop now, be it when they suppressed the Tower of Dusk before the Grand Town gathering, or their joint request for the Ashen Warlock to expel and destroy the Tower of Dusk. They had already offended the Tower of Dusk greatly. At least in their opinion, if there were any forces that treated them that way, they definitely would not let them off. Of course, the Mithril Alliance did not expect to be able to destroy the Tower of Dusk. They simply hoped to use various means to contain the development rate of the Tower of Dusk. Otherwise, with the current development speed, they would probably grow into the largest force in the breezy plains within 2 years. That would make things hard for the Mithril Alliance. Hence, in addition to the Mithril Alliance manipulating some forces, the 5 major families stood up directly. If the Mithril Alliance were to find out about the George family, it would be impossible for them to defeat the Tower of Dusk in the field of commerce. Hence, it could be said that they would do everything except resort to getting physical. They wanted to poach some customers from the Tower of Dusk, but they could not produce the quality that the Tower of Dusk could. The customers were no fools, and definitely could tell good from bad. They had poached the blacksmiths, but the same technique could not create the same thing. They tried to poach the pharmacists from the Tower of Dusk, but they belonged to Alana's pharmaceutical guild. They wanted to pull their old tricks and bribe the mages of the Tower of Dusk to obtain the formulas. However, everyone could tell that the Tower of Dusk had a bright future. Even if they got bribed, it would be impossible for them to obtain the genuine, core secrets. However, the Mithril Alliance had been running businesses in the breezy plains for over 1,000 years, and it was still possible for them to cause some trouble for the Tower of Dusk. The first thing that they had to do was to use their own resources. The 5 major families all held massive territories. Although they did not surround the Tower of Dusk, they had blocked off various directions. Hence, the 5 major families immediately set up various obstacles in their respective territories. It was impossible to do too much to the caravans of the Tower of Dusk, but they wouldn't be breaching the new order if they just did not allow the caravans to pass through their own territory. Under those circumstances, the caravans of the Tower of Dusk would have to bypass the territories of the 5 major families. It might have been possible to reach the destination in 10 days at first, but due to the bypass, they would probably take much longer. After all, the 5 major families had rather large territories. It might take the caravans 20 days, or maybe a month. That would bring about great trouble to the Tower of Dusk. The increase in the transportation costs was not a big deal, but the delay would have a significant impact on the production and sales, as well as the reputation of the Tower of Dusk. In addition to targeting the caravans of the Tower of Dusk, Mithril Alliance began to pull unscrupulous tricks to boycott the shops belonging to the Tower of Dusk, such as hiring hooligans to block the entrances or splashing filthy things at the storefronts. However, their indiscriminate means did not affect the Tower of Dusk much. Instead, it caused the Mithril Alliance to be thoroughly embarrassed. Everyone knew that the Mithril Alliance was going against the Tower of Dusk. As for the hooligans, they were all beaten into a pulp after they got caught and sent to prison. The people of the Tower of Dusk were not the only ones who would teach them a lesson. Even the customers would sometimes take action to teach those scumbags who had hampered their shopping trips. Magical weapons, equipment, and potions were sold in the shops of the Tower of Dusk, and the customers were definitely not ordinary people. They were all adventurers who adventured their lives in dangerous situations all over the world. The hooligans could scare ordinary people, but they would be bringing trouble to themselves by trying to scare the adventurers. Those indiscriminate means could only cause small losses to the Tower of Dusk, which mainly relied on large transactions to keep the business going. The retail revenue only accounted for a small part of the total. Although those despicable means were not that effective, they were indeed disgusting. In order to curb the development speed of the Tower of Dusk, the Mithril Alliance had done everything possible. They even went all out and sacrificed their prestige and reputation as an established force. However, the Tower of Dusk only pulled a single move, which immediately put the Mithril Alliance in a dilemma. Lin Li took time out of his busy schedule and wrote a 3-word letter to the Leaden Kingdom, which caused tragedy to strike the Mithril Alliance. There were plenty of established forces like the Mithril Alliance that had a heritage longer than 1,000 years and had strong foundations with larger systems than the emerging forces. Relying solely on the local business in the breezy plains would barely be enough for them to maintain their massive system, let alone develop. That was precisely the reason that the 13 families became the current 5 major families, with the opportunity that existed during the conflict with the Blood Moon clan. The 5 major families developed again by annexing their former allies, especially under the suppression of the Ashen Warlock. The distribution of forces in the breezy plains had hardly changed in the last hundreds of years. All the forces that had reached their pinnacle in the breezy plains understood that if they wanted to continue developing, they would have to expand beyond the breezy plains. Hence, the Leaden Kingdom, which had the Brilliant Shrine as its only force, as well as the Dwarf Kingdom, that had scarce animal and plant resources, had business relations with the top forces of the breezy plains. Due to the Grand Canyon of Gargus that acted like a barrier, the trade between the forces of the breezy plains and the Dwarf Kingdom had to rely on the Leaden Kingdom. However, after receiving Lin Li's letter, the Leaden Kingdom began to boycott and attack the 5 major families of the Mithril Alliance, just like what the Mithril Alliance did to the caravans of the Tower of Dusk. At the same time, the businesses of the Mithril Alliance and the Leaden Kingdom had also been suppressed from all sides. The nobles who usually benefited from the Mithril Alliance were no longer as enthusiastic as before. While the business of the 5 major families of the Mithril Alliance was suppressed, the Tower of Dusk took advantage and seized the opportunity to take over the market that had been vacated after the 5 major families had been boycotted. All of a sudden, the lives of the 5 major families became rather difficult. Even if they could pull through, it would be difficult for them to regain the foothold that they had had in the market previously. The Mithril Alliance had tried its best to harm the businesses, but there were barely any effects. However, the Tower of Dusk had only retaliated once, yet the Mithril Alliance was immediately in trouble. After losing the business deals with the Leaden Kingdom and the Dwarf Kingdom, the 5 major families did not immediately collapse, but the losses were enough to make the patriarchs of the 5 major families vomit blood. What the Mithril Alliance found especially hard to accept was not how much they had lost, but the fact that almost all the interests and benefits that they had lost were pocketed by the Tower of Dusk. They went through painstaking efforts to prevent the rapid development of the Tower of Dusk, but did not expect to let the Tower of Dusk seize the opportunity and develop well again instead. In the breezy plains, the various forces that had been paying attention to the conflict between the 2 parties began to recall the things that they had done to the Tower of Dusk before, and couldn't help but feel afraid. They couldn't imagine that the Tower of Dusk had that much power. Not only was the Tower of Dusk protected by the Ashen Warlock, it could even influence the decision-making process of the royal family of the Leaden Kingdom. They were far beyond an ordinary local force. At the same time, They were secretly somewhat grateful, and felt fortunate that they did not continue to follow the Mithril Alliance to go against the Tower of Dusk. Otherwise, they would definitely face terrible death. Even a top force like the Mithril Alliance had suffered some attacks from the Tower of Dusk. Didn't that mean that the Tower of Dusk was now the strongest in the breezy plains? The forces that were still watching hurriedly sent people to the Tower of Dusk, in hopes of clearing up the misunderstanding caused by the so-called instigator previously. Under the suppression of the Mithril Alliance, which was an established force that had been established over a millennium ago, the Tower of Dusk did not stop developing, and instead gained even more benefits. Their presence and status in the breezy plains had also skyrocketed again all of a sudden. Your favorite novels at Novelben, calm. However, no one knew if the Mithril Alliance was going to give in just like that. After all, they had a strong foundation after more than 1,000 years of accumulation. No one could predict what kind of means they were hiding. It had been a while since Lin Li returned from the Glitter Gold Trade Union. While he was waiting for Hoffman's news, he spent every moment working hard to improve his strength. It was not only for the exploration of the ruins, but also because of the major calamity that Garesco had predicted in his prophecy. Although Lin Li had already reached the pinnacle of the legendary realm, he was still making obvious progress every day, advancing step by step towards the sanctuary realm with unparalleled determination. However, on this day, Lin Li received a guest who should have visited a long time ago instead of Hoffman's notice. Master Basel, it's been a long time since I saw you. After hearing about Basil's visit from his subordinates, Lin Li rushed to the reception room immediately. The visitor waiting in the reception room was none other than Master Basel, the so-called librarian of the Duland Library. When Lin Li first arrived in the breezy plains, he managed to build the Tower of Dusk in Duland with the support of the Supreme Council. But how could a newly established guild of magic attract any new mages without any fame? At that time, be it the local forces of Duland or the people of other guilds of magic, almost everyone was waiting to see Lin Li make himself a laughingstock. They were all waiting to see him, a country bumpkin, who had left Jarosis, scurry back to his hometown. Master Basel, who was known as the librarian of the Duland Library, introduced the mages in the library who were akin to his own students into the Tower of Dusk, which was still unknown. Thus, he solved the awkward situation for Lin Li, who had been a leader with no subordinates. Although Lin Li was confident that he could make the Tower of Dusk rise to fame himself even without the help or the support of others, Master Basil's actions did give him timely assistance. Gavin, who was one of the mages Basel introduced to the Tower of Dusk at that time, had become a senior executive and made considerable contributions to the development of the Tower of Dusk in the past 2 years. Meanwhile, Alan stepped into the legendary realm and became the first legendary mage of the Tower of Dusk. Aside from Lin Li, he also served as the leader of the mages. In addition to those two, there were many others who had important positions in the Tower of Dusk. They were all from the batch of mages whom Basel had introduced into the Tower of Dusk. It could be said that Basil's support was indeed related to the rise and development of the Tower of Dusk. However, Basel had also promised Lin Li that he would take on the position of the chief judge in the Tower of Dusk in 3 months' time. However, when Lin Li had returned from the Blackstone Mountains, he could no longer be found in the Duland Library. Several 3-month periods had passed. Of course, Lin Li did not hold it against Basel. Although a legendary powerhouse like him would have made the development of the Tower of Dusk smoother in the earlier days, it would have clearly affected his authority as the president of the Tower of Dusk. After all, at that time, Lin Li was just an archmage. Even though he was the president in name, many mages would have definitely put Basel first in their hearts. However, Lin Li was surprised that although Basel looked pale and benevolent like before, and had eyes that gleamed with wisdom, he looked a little disheveled and embarrassed. Hearing Lin Li's question, Basel shook his head with a wry smile, and said, "President Flick, I'm really ashamed. I should have come to see you a long time ago, but to my surprise, I was held up by something." "Oh, please sit down." Lin Li allowed Basel to take his seat while he sat beside him. When Lin Li met Basel for the first time, he was frightened. Basel could see through everything, and he could not hide anything from him at all. From when he learned magic with Andorn to the fact that he'd achieved 28 minutes of continuous output of mana. Hence, in Lin Li's opinion, Basel was like an unpredictable and powerful figure. As such, Lin Li couldn't help but be curious about what Basel said. What kind of thing actually caused a legendary powerhouse like Basel to be tied up and cause such a long delay? Basel seemed to be somewhat embarrassed, so it seemed that the matter had not really been resolved. After Basel sat down again, he began talking about the reason that he missed the appointment before Lin Li even asked about it. "According to the agreement with you, I should have come to the Tower of Dusk long ago. but when I was preparing to come over, I received a letter from one of my former students, who asked someone to send the letter to me. Your student, Lin Li, was a little surprised. He chatted with Gavin and others before, but he never heard of Basil having any students. Although the mages in the library had received Basil's guidance before, and they could be regarded as his students in a sense, strictly speaking, they were not ones. For those mages studying in the library, Basil never regarded himself as a teacher, and only claimed that he was a librarian. The mages would only address him as their teacher in private. When in front of others, they would only call him master. Hence, Lin Li could not help but be shocked when Basil suddenly mentioned his student. My student, strictly speaking, is not a real mage, and his talent in magic is really not outstanding. Speaking of his student, Basil's tone was calm and a little prideful even though he mentioned his untalented student. He continued, actually, he's a scholar with deep knowledge in archaeology. Learning magic is only for the convenience of pursuing archaeology in the wild. What is your student's name? Lin Li asked curiously. He'd initially thought that Basil did not accept students because he was too picky. Although the mages in the library had good qualifications, they were not geniuses who only appeared once in a century or millennium. If it were not for the fact that the Tower of Dusk had provided a lot of convenience, perhaps only a few would have the hopes of stepping into the legendary realm. Surprisingly, Basil did have a student who was someone who wasn't talented in magic. The only thing that he could impress Basil with was probably his attainment in archaeology. His name is Davos. Maybe you have heard his name, Basil said in a calm tone, as he revealed a name that shocked Lin Li. Not only did Lin Li hear Davos' name before, he had heard it too often. Although Davos was not a legendary powerhouse, he was recognized as a master-level figure in the academic circle of the Felon Kingdom, especially in the field of archaeology. In the past 100 years, more than half of the written works about archaeology had been signed with Davos' name. At the same time, many materials left by predecessors had also been revised by him. He could be considered to have made outstanding contributions in the research of Anral's history. Unfortunately, Davos had never appeared during any academic meets, and legend had it that he had gotten into an accident during an archaeological trip. You mean Davos, who's known as the academic master? Lin Li asked in disbelief. Yes, it's him. When he came to Dulin Library, he actually only wanted to find out more information about the history of the Breezy Plains. He and I had a long conversation, and it was as if we're longtime friends. Initially, I only taught him some means to protect himself when he goes out in the wild. I didn't expect him to be so stubborn as to insist that I'm his teacher just because I taught him something. At the mention of it, Basil had a look of helplessness and relief on his face. At the thought of Davos' identity as an academic master, a scene appeared in Lin Li's mind. It was that of a thin, neatly dressed middle-aged man who was wearing small, round gold-framed glasses. He was seated opposite Basil with a serious expression, and stubbornly addressing Basil as his teacher. It is said that Davos disappeared more than 20 years ago, and there were plenty of rumors about him getting into an accident in the wild. To my surprise, he was still alive. I don't know what he had experienced over the past 20 years. An archaeologist that had been missing for more than 20 years sent a letter after this time. A legendary mage spent 2 years because of that matter. Lin Li was getting increasingly interested in Basil's missing. Yeah, I initially thought that he might have met with a mishap too. Otherwise, how could there have been no news about him for more than 20 years? After receiving the letter and seeing his handwriting, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on him. I even compared his handwriting in the letter to that in his notes. Basil was rather emotional after he recalled how surprised he felt when he received the letter. A person he valued had gone missing for more than 20 years, and one day, he suddenly received a letter from him. Lin Li could totally imagine the disbelief and surprise that he felt. Hence, he smiled empathetically, and said, Master Basil, I can imagine how you feel. Master Basil, where did you see him this time? Later, I read the content of the letter, and only then did I know that he had lived with the tribe of the Dwarf Kingdom for more than 20 years. In the letter, he mentioned that he had found something, and he hoped that I could go over and take a look. Firstly, I wanted to ensure that he was safe, and secondly, I was a little curious about what he discovered, so I decided to meet him at the location that he suggested. At this point, Basil was a little embarrassed. Not only had he bailed on Lin Li, and left in a hurry, he had also failed to give Lin Li an explanation, which was somewhat inappropriate. You don't have to be too bothered by that agreement. I believe no one would have the time to consider other matters, had they been in your position in that situation. Seeing that Basil was feeling embarrassed, Lin Li decided to pacify him, after which he asked in puzzlement, could it be that Davos has stayed in that place for more than 20 years? Yes. When I found him at the location he told me about, he was completely different from what he used to look like. He was fully bearded, and was sitting on the ground and laughing loudly with the dwarfs while chugging a large glass of ale. The ale was spilled all over his chest, but he didn't care. I'm afraid if it were someone else, they might not be able to recognize him. Back then, he was a gentlemanly and poised aristocratic scholar. However, his attitude towards me didn't change much. He still addresses me as his teacher. Basil sighed, but the joy on his face was still there. What on earth did he find? He actually lived with the dwarf tribe for more than 20 years. Surely he's not planning to live in seclusion there, is he? Lin Li became more curious about Davos' discovery because it actually made him, an authoritative archaeologist, stay there for 20 years. He said in the letter that he seemed to have found clues related to the Pantheon, but due to his limitations, he couldn't explore further. So he thought about me, the librarian who does nothing in the library. Basil did not hide anything from Lin Li, and simply mentioned the content of the letter. The Pantheon was known to everyone in the world of Anral, but almost no one knew the true situation of the Pantheon. There were only various legends that could not be verified. Among the many legends, there was a saying that the Titans had called the Pantheon their home in the prehistoric times. Lin Li had heard about that saying from Sindros and Borg from the Dark Blade. It was said that the ancient Wyrms and the Titans had fought endlessly during the prehistoric times. The ancient Wyrms were led by the Guardians' Council, that was composed of 5 dragon aspects, while the Titans were led by the Pantheon. When exploring the ruins of the Higa mountain range, the members of the Dark Blade believed that the ruins were related to the Pantheon, but it turned out that it was actually a sky castle. According to Sindros, the Pantheon was the resting place of the spirits of deceased Titans, and it was said that they were drifting in the endless chaos of time and space such that even the gods couldn't find them. However, that legend could not be proved, either. Except for the immortal king, who had disappeared in Garesco, no one had the ability to explore the chaos of time and space, let alone find the legendary Pantheon. Lin Li once slipped into the endless labyrinth in the Sky Castle, where he watched the entire evolution of the world of Anral and entered a massive palace. The palace was so large that he was just like an insignificant ant when he was in there. Based on the size of the palace, he once thought that it should be the legendary Pantheon, but there was nothing in the palace that could prove his conjecture. It would be impossible to get an accurate answer. In any case, although no one knew what the Pantheon was like, the people were all very sure of the existence of that place. The Pantheon had been mentioned frequently in numerous historical materials that circulated in Anral. The Pantheon had also appeared in the history recorded by the High Elves, but there wasn't a detailed description of it. The Pantheon. Lin Li was not too surprised when he heard the name, but he showed some apprehension. The Pantheon was a mysterious existence, which countless powerful figures in history had tried to find. They had searched almost all the places they could search in Anral, but no one succeeded. Although Davos was an academic master and an expert archaeologist, his personal strength was limited, and he could not delve too deep into areas that were too dangerous. It was probably very difficult for anyone to set foot in that area. Seeing that there was apprehension on Lin Li's face, Basil smiled and said, "It seems that you have also thought about it. Although Davos has learned magic from me, his abilities are still very limited. Hence, when I saw that the Pantheon was mentioned in the letter, I was also very skeptical. After I found him in the dwarf tribe, I made some preparations and set off from Danmuro under his lead. We went all the way to the north and made it to the depths of the Arctic snowfield, where I finally saw an ancient ruin he found. There really is one." Lin Li couldn't help but get a great shock. The depths of the Arctic snowfield were definitely a forbidden zone for living beings, let alone humans. Even the Wyrms wouldn't dare to set foot there, except the ancient ice blast Wyrm. The freezing temperatures were one reason. Another reason was the terrible hurricanes that often occurred there. Even large ice blocks would be trapped, and the power was strong enough to smash Wyrms as well. Yes, but it wasn't the Pantheon. It was a ruin of the High Elves, Basil answered with a nod. Lin Li was a little speechless. The appearance of the ruins of the High Elves was probably even more incredible than the Pantheon. However, Lin Li thought of the collaboration between him and Hoffman of the Glitter Gold Trade Union. Since there might be the High Elves' relics in the huge canyon of Gargus, Basil's and Davos' discovery might not be that puzzling. Basil didn't know about Lin Li's cooperation with Hoffman, and thus thought that Lin Li definitely did not believe the things he said. As such, he explained, "I know the High Elves have always detested cold environments, and they almost never set foot in the extreme north according to history. It's actually normal for you not to believe it. When I saw the ruins, I couldn't believe my eyes, either. But as we got deeper, we found some sculptures that were made in the style of the High Elves. I also saw some totems of theirs. Those findings made me more sure of the speculations. It's not that I don't believe you, but this piece of news is just really surprising." Although Lin Li had not had much contact with Basil, he knew that Basil was known as a knowledgeable person in the breezy plains. Besides, Davos was also a rather authoritative archaeological expert. It was almost impossible for it to be a misunderstanding. Davos probably thought that the ruins were the pantheon because he couldn't explore deeper due to his limitations in strength. He naturally did not expect that the High Elves would appear in such a cold and harsh environment. It's a pity that Davos and I still seem to be too weak in power to go too deep into the ruins to explore. However, we found some broken pieces of paper at the entrance, and some were with magic runes. While speaking, Basil took out some things and placed them on the table. Were these found in the ruins? Lin Li shifted his gaze onto the paper, only to see that there were various alchemy formulas written on them. However, there were too many missing parts, so it was impossible to see what formulas they were. There were also some pieces of paper with various magic symbols painted on them, together with some High Elves print. Yes, those were all that we found. Unfortunately, they're not enough for us to learn more about the ruins. Look at the text on this piece of paper. Basil pointed at a broken piece of paper and made Lin Li look at the print. He then said in a puzzled tone, "A huge gully is mentioned here. Could it be the Immortal King?" The Immortal King. Lin Li could not help but be cautious when he saw those words. The Immortal King was a godlike existence and an unparalleled powerhouse, who killed the Dragon of Destruction. Everything that was related to the Immortal King could not be taken lightly. Basil asked Lin Li to look at the things he had collected while he leaned back in his chair. He seemed to be deep in thought, and his eyes were a little glassy. He muttered, "What could that huge gully be?" After Lin Li saw those things, he didn't manage to find any special clues, but when he heard Basil talking to himself, he suddenly got an idea, and he wondered, could the huge gully mentioned on that piece of paper refer to the huge canyon of Gargus? At the thought of it, he said, "Master Basil, I do have some idea about that huge gully." "Yeah, what exactly is it?" Basil muttered. Then, all of a sudden, he realized what Lin Li was talking about. He quickly looked at Lin Li in disbelief, and asked, "What did you say just now? Do you know what this huge gully is?" Lin Li understood the reason for Basil's reaction. If it were someone else, they would definitely be conflicted after spending almost 2 years dwelling on that issue. Hence, he said, "Master Basil, I went to the Glitter Gold Trade Union a few days ago, and Master Hoffman spoke to me about something." He then told Basil briefly about the cooperation between him and Hoffman. He also mentioned his conjecture about the huge gully being the huge canyon of Gargus. Listening to Lin Li's words, Basil's eyes gradually lit up, and he couldn't help but mutter to himself, "Is it really it? Master Basil, we've already agreed to explore the huge canyon of Gargus together with Hoffman. It just so happens that you've come back this time. Why don't you join us in exploring the ruins?" Seeing that Basil was a little tempted, Lin Li decided to let him join them. This doesn't seem to be appropriate. Although Basil had previously agreed to join the Tower of Dusk and serve as the chief judge of the Tower of Dusk, he had yet to report his current identity to the Supreme Council. Hence, strictly speaking, he was not considered part of the Tower of Dusk, which made him somewhat hesitant. Lin Li guessed what Basil was worried about. Hence, he smilingly said, "Haha, Master Basil, you think too much. Since you have agreed to join the Tower of Dusk, it wouldn't matter if you reported or not. I believe you." "Okay, I'll proceed with your arrangements then, President." Basil's good mood made him respond to Lin Li jokingly. Although Basil had been working as a librarian in Dulan Library, he was rather prestigious in the hearts of the mages of the Breezy Plains. Most of the mages who had received his guidance regarded him as their teacher. That was great news to Lin Li and the mages of the Tower of Dusk. A few days after Basil returned, Lin Li received a letter from Hoffman, which stated that the Glitter Gold Trade Union's team of adventurers was ready to set off from Lafalia City. It was also stated in the letter that the meeting point agreed upon was near the huge canyon of Gargus, so there would be no need for the people of the Tower of Dusk to meet them at Lafalia City. Knowing they might be exploring the ruins of the High Elven royal family, Lin Li took the consideration of the team's strength seriously when deciding on the members. The first 2 members of the team were the legendary level undead servants Ufalusi and Norfaler, followed by Conoris, who had the perfect body, and Angelano, who had the alchemy colossus. Basil, who had just returned, Alan, who had just stepped into the legendary realm, and a team of mages composed of hundreds of archmages were also part of the team. This time, Lin Li decided to bring all the legendary level members that he could. It was almost like he was going all out. Lin Li was not worried about the safety of the Tower of Dusk. After hearing the words of the Ashen Warlock, the large and small forces of the Breezy Plains did not dare to blatantly lay a finger on the Tower of Dusk. Hence, there was no need to leave behind too much manpower for guarding the place. Besides, even if someone was harboring ill intentions about the Tower of Dusk, they wouldn't be able to escape alive, because they would be attacked by the magical crystal cannons, all killer rays, and the powerful eternal furnace that was on top of the Tower of Dusk. The expedition team from the Tower of Dusk set off for the huge canyon of Gargus. Along the way, they managed to frighten those who paid attention to the Tower of Dusk, especially the ones who had offended them. They were all terrified, and thought that the Tower of Dusk was planning to settle scores with them. The Mithril Alliance kept their guard up even more, and stayed alert after receiving the news. The members of the headquarters of each of the 5 major families were panic-stricken, and began to prepare for the future. Yes, the Ashen Warlock did say that no one was allowed to break the existing peace, but that would depend on who the people in question were. Judging from the situation of the gathering in Grand Town, it was obvious that the Ashen Warlock valued the president of the Tower of Dusk, and they might have reached an agreement during the secret conversation that they had in the Tower of Ashes. However, Lin Li did not care about what those forces were thinking about or getting up to. The expedition team went all the way north, and soon arrived at the northern boundary of the Breezy Plains, where they entered Loch Damer and headed towards the location that they had agreed upon with Hoffman. A few days later, the team from the Tower of Dusk arrived in the vicinity of the huge canyon of Gargus, where they joined the team from the Glitter Gold Trade Union, which had already set up a camp. Hoffman, who had received the news, led several senior officials from the Glitter Gold Trade Union out of the camp. After meeting with Lin Li and the rest, Hoffman immediately noticed Basil, who was beside Lin Li, and got a great shock. Although Basil had been living in seclusion in Dewland Library, he was prestigious amongst the mages, and Hoffman, the president of the Glitter Gold Trade Union, definitely knew who he was. Hoffman didn't even bother to say hello to Lin Li, and instead asked Basil in shock, "Master Basil, you?" Basil smiled, and said, "I have joined the Tower of Dusk." Upon hearing this, Hoffman was even more shocked. He turned to look at Lin Li inquisitively. Lin Li had long predicted that Hoffman would be shocked. Hence, he explained, "Master Basil has agreed to serve as the chief judge of the Tower of Dusk, but we haven't held an inauguration ceremony yet because of this expedition. In a guild of magic, the chief judge played an extremely important role, and his authority would not be below that of the leader. Any matter related to the safety of the guild would be handled by the chief judge, who'd have full authority. Sometimes, he might even override the power of the president of the guild. It would be no exaggeration to say that to some extent, the chief judge was akin to another president of the guild. Hence, unlike other members of the guild, the chief judge would have to go through a very formal inauguration ceremony. Lin Li got his team to set up a camp nearby while he led Basil and the others into the Glitter Gold Trade Union's camp. This time, the Glitter Gold Trade Union sent quite a few members, including the legendary mage Thomas, the sword sage Jeremy, the legendary mage Elvin, and the pair of twin legendary assassins, Jen Syke. In addition to those major shareholders, almost half of the mages of the Glitter Gold Trade Union were there. There were probably about 100-odd archmages. Besides, there were also 100 warriors who were above level 15, and were the elites of the Skyfire Knights. However, they did not bring their mounts due to the environment there. The senior executives of the two parties sat in the tent of the Glitter Gold Trade Union, and Hoffman took out a map of the huge canyon of Gargus. However, the illustration was not complete, and it was obviously drawn by the previous expedition team. However, it didn't take long for everyone to discuss the plan for the expedition inside the tent. All of a sudden, there was a loud noise outside the camp. A soldier barged into the tent and said, "Mr. President, there are a lot of undead creatures outside the camp." Everyone couldn't help but be surprised. At this moment, it was still daytime, and ordinary low-level undead creatures were not allowed to move under the sun. The appearance of a large number of undead creatures was rather peculiar. Sunlight was a natural form of holy light, although its power was scattered, and thus it did not have powerful purification powers. It was rather deadly to low-level undead creatures. Even in the gathering places of the undead creatures, such as the Shadowglen and Scar of Death, there would be a dense layer of death energy fog that would shield them from the sun, while the low-level undead creatures would fall into deep slumber underground during the day. It was still sunny in the huge canyon of Gargus, where the sunlight was particularly dazzling under the reflection of the ice and snow, making it seem like the rays were stronger than usual. However, even under such circumstances, Lin Li, Hoffman, and the rest still managed to see a dense cluster of undead creatures that were swarming in like a white tide from a spot that was 1 or 2 kilometers away from the camp. Upon sight of the undead creatures that were swarming towards the camp, Lin Li and the others could not help but be shocked, because the undead creatures were a little different from the ones they had seen before. That explained the sudden commotion in the camp. The types of undead creatures could be seen at first glance, and the one rushing to the front was still the skeletal warriors, which were the perpetual cannon fodder of the undead creatures. However, the skeletal warriors were all covered with crystal clear ice, and seemed to be wearing crystal armor that glistened under the sunlight. The originally skinny skeletal warriors also appeared to be much stronger and more powerful due to the fact that they were covered in ice. Another thing that caught the attention of Lin Li and the rest was the diversity of the skeletal warriors. Not all of them were formed from human bones. Some of them were shorter but thicker, which suggested that they should have been made out of dwarven bones, while some had horns or fangs, and were obviously related to beastmen. Behind those human, dwarven, and beastmen skeletal warriors, there were giant skeletons, which were the skeletons of giants that were said to have the blood of titans. Legend has it that this was once a battlefield where all races fought, and it seems to be true, Hoffman muttered to himself. The huge canyon of Gargus was known to be an insurmountable moat, but it stretched for thousands of miles, and did not quite divide the entire continent in half. Although the Tower of Dusk and the Glitter Gold Trade Union did not meet at the end of the Grand Canyon, they were about 100 miles away. The terrain there made it easier for them to enter the canyon. It was said that the rebellion alliance formed by various major races had fought several battles with the High Elves because they wanted to rebel against the rule of the High Elves. Perhaps the rebels, too, wanted to take advantage of the cold environment to affect the High Elves back then, but it turned out that they simply didn't enjoy cold temperatures. The outcome of the battle was imaginable. It was said that hundreds of thousands of rebels were buried under the white ice and snow there, and many of them were powerful figures of various races. However, due to the harsh environment there, which was cold and dry unlike the rancid Shadowglen and Scar of Death, Lin Li and the rest did not notice the hidden death aura. That was also partly due to the gloominess that was permeating the huge canyon. Upon sight of the ice-armored undead creatures at this moment, everyone recalled the legend about that place. Although the undead creatures all had peculiar appearance and were wrapped in armor like ice, they were, after all, just some low-level skeletal warriors and hell ghouls. Hence, they did not constitute a substantial threat to the powerful expedition that consisted of 300-400 powerhouses who were above level 15. After the undead creatures entered the firing range, the archmages who had been prepared for a long time raised their staffs, and various rays of light from magical spells instantly filled the air. The magical elements in the air seemed to have been ignited by Mars, as they erupted instantly. Although only less than 100 archmages had launched offensive spells, the magic storm formed by all kinds of spells was rather amazing as it swept towards the undead creatures like a thunderstorm. All of a sudden, ice spikes and bones flew all over the sky, and the rising fog almost covered the entire area. When the thick fog dissipated and everything calmed down, the menacing army of undead creatures had completely disappeared outside the camp, leaving only broken limbs strewn all over the ground. Some of the mages of the Tower of Dusk continued to build their own camp as if nothing had happened. Although the undead creatures were rather peculiar, Lin Li shook his head slightly after seeing that they were not that much stronger than their ordinary counterparts. However, when Lin Li turned around and prepared to return to the tent of the Glitter Gold Trade Union to continue discussing the exploration plan, he saw that Ufalusi and Norfaler who were behind him looked rather bizarre. Seeing the two of them gawk at the undead creatures like people who saw a feast of delicacies after starving for several days, Lin Li immediately understood what was going on. Smiling, he said, "You two don't need to follow me, just do whatever you want. Go ahead." He then returned to the tent with Hoffman and the others. Hearing Lin Li's instructions, Ufalusi and Norfaler beamed with joy as they walked away from the camp together. Each of them chanted a short spell in the direction of the destroyed army of undead creatures, only for everyone to see that there were suddenly various orbs of light in the place that had quieted down again. The orbs looked just like fireflies that were swarming towards the undead duo. They were the soul fire of the undead creatures that had died. Unfortunately, many had been completely extinguished under the scouring of the magic storm. The rest was also damaged, and much worse than complete soul fire. After absorbing the soul fire, Norfaler and Ufalusi looked at each other before returning to the camp while everyone looked at them with puzzlement. They did not enter, and simply waited outside. In the tent, Lin Li, Hoffman, and the others talked about the undead creatures just now, but they didn't have any clues. Hence, they continued to plan exploring the ruins. However, not long after they started talking again, there was another magical explosion outside, and someone barged in to report that another group of undead creatures had arrived. However, this time, everyone knew the strength of those undead creatures. Only when the group of undead creatures were wiped out did they send someone to report about it. Strange. What's wrong with these undead creatures? We may give out our auras, but they can't possibly be unafraid of sunlight anymore, can they? Hoffman muttered with a frown after hearing his subordinate's report. Master Hoffman, didn't the expedition team that you sent earlier find a large number of undead creatures? Lin Li asked in puzzlement. Hoffman once said that a team of 50 people had been sent to confirm the authenticity of the clues, but only 2 returned alive. Didn't they mention any undead creatures in their report? Hoffman shook his head, pointed to a spot on the map, and said to Lin Li and others, "The expedition entered the canyon from a spot more than 100 miles away from here, and they only encountered individual undead creatures along the way. They did not encounter such a large group of undead creatures, so this information has not been included in the section of key things to note. In that case, why did we meet at this place instead of the spot where they began entering the canyon?" Lin Li continued to ask. Since the previous expedition in front had explored it, it was, in theory, obviously easier to enter according to the route that had been tried previously. That was also a problem that Lin Li had been wondering about ever since he was informed about the meeting point. 1. Probably the Roman god Eric. That's where the name Helios came from, though that one's Greek. This is a route that had been accidentally discovered when the last two members of the expedition team retreated. It's much safer than going in from the front. However, no one thought that there would be so many undead creatures here. Those two members didn't encounter any undead creatures when they evacuated in the beginning. Hoffman obviously couldn't understand why those undead creatures had to create trouble for him and the others. As he was talking, the roaring of magical spells began again in the camp that had just quieted down. The people in the tent looked at each other helplessly. As expected, someone soon reported that another group of undead creatures had attacked the camp. If it happened once, it could be a coincidence, but not if it happened 3 or 4 times. Things were definitely not simple. "Sir, our camp has been surrounded by an unknown number of undead creatures." Soon after the third wave of undead creatures was eliminated, someone went into the tent again to break the piece of news, which made everyone feel uneasy. Lin Li and the others went outside the tent and looked around the camp, only to see the surging army of undead creatures swarming towards the camp. At the front, there were still skeletal warriors wearing ice armor. At the back, there were hellghouls and skeletal mages that were continuously casting low-level necromagic like hellfire bullets. Although they were not powerful, they were overwhelming and daunting. Lin Li cast a warlock's eyes into the air and carefully observed the army of undead creatures. There were many more undead creatures in this wave than in the previous 3 waves combined. There were probably at least nearly 100,000 of them. Lin Li had seen such a large-scale army of undead creatures, and he had seen many more in the Shadowglen, the Seven Realm Spiral, and the Sky Castle. However, the sight of the vast number of undead creatures still made everyone feel uneasy. However, despite the situation, not everyone was worried. Ufalusi and Norfaler were extremely excited. Ufalusi drove the humorous Wyrm and flew directly above the undead creatures before continuously casting powerful necromagic spells. As the undead creatures collapsed under the spells, countless rays of light emerged from their remains and shot directly at Ufalusi and the humorous Wyrm. Norfaler wielded a pair of daggers and had already darted towards the undead creatures. The undead creatures that were wrapped in ice were falling to the ground in rows when hit with the light reflected off the daggers like harvested crops. While Norfaler rushed to and fro, there were countless rays of light dashing over from behind like they were tailing him. Whenever Norfaler's figure paused, the light would dash into his body. Ufalusi and Norfaler were undead creatures. Although they also had other ways to improve their strength, the most direct and quickest method was undoubtedly to tackle the soul fire. Devouring a large amount of soul fire from other undead creatures would allow one's soul fire to be strengthened, and it would be akin to humans increasing their own potential. Although the increase in strength wouldn't be obvious, it would increase one's capacity. To them, soul fire was undoubtedly the best supplement in the world that nothing else could replace. Although the number of undead creatures was large, Ufalusi and Norfaler were both genuine legendary powerhouses. The members of the expedition team also had strength of at least level 15. Hence, the undead creatures could not do much damage to the team. They were soon destroyed. After annihilating that wave of undead creatures, Ufalusi and Norfaler returned to Lin Li. The eyes of the 2 undead servants were filled with excitement. Obviously, the soul fire that had been harvested by them had benefited them greatly. As long as they filled an enlarged bucket with water, there would immediately be a great leap in strength. However, the victory did not make the Tower of Dusk and the senior executives of the Glitter Gold happy. Instead, they frowned and did not hide their worry. The undead creatures had arrived too mysteriously, and it was as if they had identified the expedition team as their enemies. What do these undead creatures want to do? Does the location of our camp have any impact on them? Hoffman asked his subordinates about the surrounding environment, but did not find out anything special. Could it be that our arrival disturbed them? Lin Li asked, stating his guess. However, he immediately shook his head to deny it. They had merely disturbed it, and it would not cause the undead creatures to disregard the threat posed by the sunlight. They immediately attacked the expedition team in broad daylight. The abnormal behavior of the undead creatures made everyone feel very puzzled. Their speculations could not explain anything, either. Of all members of the 2 teams, Thomas and Basil were the most knowledgeable. However, the two masters felt that they could not grasp the key to the problem, regardless of the reason. I think it is impossible for us to get some rest here. It is still daytime, and there are already undead creatures attacking the camp. If night comes, I'm afraid, said Hoffman, who was still somewhat helpless after the discussion. In this case, I think it's better to enter the huge canyon in advance while it's still bright, not to cause unnecessary losses here, Lin Li suggested. Although the waves of attacks from the undead creatures did not cause any loss to the expedition team, everyone knew that the undead creatures were the most active at night. There were already numerous undead creatures there, and if they were to wait until night, the place would really become a world of undead creatures. Even if there were many legendary powerhouses in the team, no one could guarantee that there would be no accidents in the battle with the undead creatures. Indeed, I think so too. Hearing Lin Li's suggestion, Hoffman nodded, and after agreeing with the others, he ordered his men to clean up the camp. They immediately started preparing for their entrance into the huge canyon. Following the orders of Hoffman and Lin Li, the camps of the two forces immediately got levelier. The Tower of Dusk had yet to set up a camp, hence, they managed to save themselves a lot of hassle. As for the Glitter Gold Trade Union, they had a lot more manpower in the first place, and thus it didn't take them much time to clean up. Soon, the two teams were ready to set off again, and under the leadership of Hoffman and Lin Li, they headed towards the huge canyon. There was a large gap on the cliff at the side of the canyon. If one were to peek through the gap, they would see a dangerous road that could not quite be considered a road. It would extend diagonally toward the bottom of the canyon. That was the route that Hoffman said would provide easier entry to the canyon. It was discovered by two members who had evacuated. In fact, the Gargus Canyon was said to be bottomless, but it was only so for ordinary people. For the archmages who had mastered the levitation spell, it was not very difficult to go directly to the bottom of the canyon. However, considering the previous attacks by undead creatures, they decided to slowly walk along the slope to the bottom of the canyon for Safida's sake. The road on the mountain was difficult and dangerous. If they were not careful, they might fall and break their bones. However, the expedition team consisted of powerhouses who were all above level 15, not to mention the archmages who could levitate. Even the level 15 warriors were all agile and active. Any small projection would allow them to stand firmly. Hence, while the entire team went through plenty of danger along the way, none of the members got injured. The expedition team descended to the bottom of the huge canyon. The sky above their heads had become a line, and light almost completely disappeared in the surroundings. The mages cast their magical spells to light up the path. Spheres of light bounced around the team, emitting soft rays of light that dispelled the darkness around them. After a short rest, the expedition team continued without stopping under Hoffman's suggestion. Instead, they continued to advance toward the depths of the canyon. Although the team had just descended from a cliff that was more than a kilometer high, no one objected to Hoffman's proposal. If they were ordinary people, they would be exhausted and paralyzed, but the powerhouses who were above level 15 did not get affected much. Stay alert. Shortly after the team entered the depths of the canyon, Hoffman suddenly issued a warning to the team when he heard that the legendary assassin Ja, who was in charge of finding the way, had returned. The Tower of Dusk had also kept their guard up after hearing Lin Li's instructions. Master Hoffman, did you find anything? Lin Li asked Hoffman when he walked towards the people of the Glitter Gold Trade Union. When they were outside, they encountered a large number of undead creatures. Now that they had entered the canyon, they did not encounter any obstacles, but no one believed that it was really possible to get to the destination easily. At this moment, Hoffman looked extremely sullen, and he said in a low voice, "The human expedition team that we discovered in front is very likely to have the same agenda as us." Hearing this news, Lin Li couldn't help but frown, and he said, "Could it be because our exploration plan was leaked?" Hoffman said that it was possible, but in fact everyone knew that the things that appeared in the canyon were definitely not for business. "Let's go to the front and see where this person is from," Hoffman said, and then ordered his subordinates, "Stay alert, continue to advance forward." Lin Li did not return to the team of the Tower of Dusk, and instead followed Hoffman to continue advancing with the team. Lin Li was also very puzzled about the expedition team that suddenly appeared. Hoffman once vowed that only the Glitter Gold Trade Union knew about the clues. After reaching an agreement for cooperation with Hoffman, Lin Li and the members of the Tower of Dusk did not mention it to anyone, either. Hence, the news definitely couldn't have leaked from the Tower of Dusk. However, it seemed unlikely for the Glitter Gold Trade Union to be the ones to leak the news. It was said that only Hoffman and Thomas knew about the matter. The other major shareholders did not know about it before they set off. In fact, even the two explorers who were lucky to survive were unclear if the information they discovered was of any value. The expedition team advanced slowly while keeping their guard up. After making a few turns in the canyon, they finally saw another expedition team that was also staying vigilant. As the two teams met, the atmosphere suddenly became a lot more somber, as if a tiny bit of peculiarity would cause an intense battle to break out. Damn, why are these guys here? Hoffman could not help but curse under his breath after seeing the leader of that team. At this moment, Lin Li also saw several acquaintances in the opposing team. At the same time, he also found out about their origin. The opposing team was led by two people. One was Joseph, who asked to expel the Tower of Dusk when they were in Grand Town, and was also the current leader of the Mithril Alliance. The other was the patriarch of the Caesar family, Claus. It was said that the Caesar family had fallen out with the Mithril Alliance because of an issue, which also caused them to withdraw from the Mithril Alliance in a fit of anger. Although the two forces were not hostile towards each other in the breezy plains, they rarely contacted each other. It seemed that the rumors were rather unreliable. Either that, or they had been acting all along. However, what made Lin Li feel puzzled was the fact that there was a young man who was not very strong among the people behind Joseph and Claus, yet was looking at Lin Li with immense hatred. Lin Li touched his chin, feeling somewhat bewildered, and wondered, since when did I have such a weak enemy? The teams from the Glitter Gold Trade Union and the Tower of Dusk stopped after traveling a safe distance. Hoffman and Lin Li walked out of the team slowly and approached the expedition team of the Mithril Alliance. At the same time, Joseph and Claus, as well as the patriarchs of the Mithril League, walked out of their teams and walked towards Hoffman and Lin Li. So it's you, Patriarch Joseph. The world is really small. I didn't expect that we could run into each other in such a place. Hoffman did live up to his identity as a businessman. Although he was very upset deep down, he did not show it on his face. Haha, President Hoffman, President Flick, it's indeed a coincidence. If I hadn't believed in your character, I would have thought that I was being tailed, Joseph said with a mirthless smile. Lately, the Tower of Dusk had embarrassed the Mithril Alliance in the breezy plains. Not only did they not gain any benefits, they ended up losing a lot of gold coins. He even wanted to kill his opponent. However, although they were no longer in the breezy plains, Ashen Warlock's words still were a great deterrent. After all, the Mithril Alliance was still from the breezy plains. Not to mention that Joseph had also clearly witnessed the strength of the Tower of Dusk and the Glitter Gold Trade Union. Not only were they not inferior to the Mithril Alliance, they were actually much stronger. If they were to get physical, the Mithril Alliance might be at the losing end. On the other hand, Hoffman and Lin Li were also unwilling to face unnecessary trouble. After all, the other party was also an expedition team that was united by two top forces, and their strength was not to be belittled. The Mithril Alliance and the Caesar family had more than 10 legendary powerhouses, and the teams behind them composed of mages and members of other professions were also on par with theirs. If they were to really get into a fight, the consequences would probably be dire. Both parties were talking to each other pointlessly. Although they seemed to be harmonious on the surface, not everyone was satisfied with the situation. The Mithril Alliance had recognized Lin Li as an enemy. At last, someone could not control themselves any longer, and pointed at Lin Li in a bid to curse at him. However, at this moment, the patriarch of the Caesar family, Claus, who was standing beside Joseph, raised his hand to stop the young man. He hollered, "Charles, who are you to speak here? Get lost." But Grandpa, Charles stopped abruptly, and looked at his grandfather with an aggrieved expression. Even if he could not keep his position as the patriarch of the Dida family, his grandfather never reprimanded him that sternly. Yet, his grandfather actually embarrassed him in front of so many people, because of the culprit who'd made him lose his throne. What? Don't you have any basic etiquette? He's President Flick of the Tower of Dusk. Go back immediately. Don't disgrace me here. Claus immediately hollered at him sternly in front of everyone, no longer appearing as calm and polite as he used to. Charles glared at Lin Li angrily, but didn't dare to go against his grandfather's instructions. Hence, he turned around and returned to his team unwillingly. However, after he returned, he threw a tantrum at the people around him before glaring at Lin Li with resentment in his eyes as if he detested him greatly. How could he not hate him? He was originally the head of the Dida family, which was extremely glorious. Yet, the damned Flick caused the mages of his family to suffer severe mental damage and lose all chances of further progress. As a result, he was also stripped of his position of patriarch. How could his hatred be described by words? Charles had no idea why his grandfather stopped him. He could only look at his enemy and imagine killing him deep inside. Seeing that Charles had returned after being reprimanded, the people from the Mithril Alliance were relieved. If Charles were to really curse his heart out, a conflict would be inevitable. They knew that it would be the case based on their understanding of the young president of the Tower of Dusk. If that were to happen, how could they continue exploring the ruins? In fact, Lin Li and Charles hadn't seen each other much during the incident in Grand Town. Hence, Lin Li never thought that Charles would hate him. However, after hearing Charles' voice, when he spoke and hearing Norfler's explanation, he finally learned about the entire story. It turns out that Charles is the grandson of Claus. It's no wonder that he was appointed as the patriarch of the Dida family. They must have hoped to use those ties and get the Caesar family to help them maintain their position in the Mithril Alliance. Unfortunately, this kid is still not cut out to be a leader even though he's talented in magic, Hoffman whispered to Lin Li when Claus was reprimanding Charles. At this moment, Charles turned to look at Lin Li again after his grandchild left. President Flick, I've embarrassed myself. This child has been neglected since his father passed away when he was a child. I hope you don't mind. Patriarch Claus, you're making it sound too serious. It's just a small matter. I won't take it to heart, Lin Li replied with a smile. Although the Tower of Dusk and the Mithril Alliance were at odds, exploring the ruins was the most important thing at the moment. Hence, Lin Li responded very politely. The only reason the two parties had a conversation was undoubtedly for the sake of avoiding unnecessary conflicts. At the same time, they also hoped that the other party would not provoke them. They then returned to each of their own teams, before moving forward in the same direction. Upon arriving at an open space in the canyon, they stopped in unison, and began to build their respective camps. 4 mini legendary powerhouses. It wouldn't matter whether they took breaks or not. Even if they did not take a break for several days or months, they would not feel any obvious fatigue. However, the archmages and warriors below level 15 would all have to get enough rest to replenish energy if they wanted to maintain peak combat power when dealing with various emergencies. After the meeting between the two teams today, the senior executives of both parties also had to reconsider the next part of their plan. After all, a strong competitor appeared, and there had been many changes. Grandpa, why are you so polite to that Flick? Had he not hurt the people under me? Those old fogies wouldn't have stripped me of my position as patriarch. Charles waited for the chance to be alone with his grandfather, and he finally aired his grievances immediately. He had been in the position of patriarch for less than 2 years, yet he was sacked. It was all Flick's fault. Old fogey, is that what you call me behind my back too? Claus glowered at him and raised his hand in a bid to hit him. Seeing that his grandfather was not really angry, Charles quickly stepped aside and begged for mercy. Please calm down. How could I have the audacity to say that about you? I meant the elders of the Dida family. They were the ones who made me the patriarch, and also the ones who stripped me of my position. Patriarch, do you think it is a glorious thing to be a patriarch? That is a responsibility. If your father hadn't been obsessed with that position, he wouldn't have been dragged down for decades without gaining any strength. In the end, he even thought about summoning the abyssal demon dragon. If not for that, he wouldn't have implicated your mother. At the mention of his deceased daughter, Claus couldn't help but feel a little gloomy as he returned to his seat. Grandpa, the Mithril Alliance and the Tower of Dusk are already at odds. Why are you still to them? With the power of the Mithril Alliance and the Caesar family, it'd be a piece of cake to deal with them. Compared to his deceased parents, Charles was still more concerned about the seat of the patriarch. If he had never taken the seat, he wouldn't have been that affected. The point was that he had been assumed the position for 2 years, and felt that he was above everyone else. What about the Glitter Gold Trade Union? Claus did not reprimand Charles for his self-righteousness. In his opinion, his grandson was highly talented in magic, and he would definitely be able to step into the legendary realm in no time. He could slowly educate his grandson in other aspects. That was also the reason he didn't blame his grandson much after the unexpected failure of his plan to control the Dida family. After all, a legendary powerhouse was also very important to a force. The Glitter Gold Trade Union. After all, the Glitter Gold Trade Union and the Tower of Dusk are only temporary partners. Unlike the Mithril Alliance, we're an alliance that has been around for over 1,000 years. I doubt the Glitter Gold Trade Union would help the Tower of Dusk if we went against them, Charles answered. HMPH, an alliance that has been around for over 1,000 years. At the beginning, there were 13 families, but why are there only 6 left? Why did we, the Caesar family, withdraw from the alliance? Claus said with disdain, but he also knew that his grandson was not one who could keep secrets, so he didn't explain too much to him. Instead, he switched back to the main topic, and said, do you really think we can easily deal with the Tower of Dusk even if the Glitter Gold Trade Union doesn't help them? Charles was just an archmage in the end, so his outlook was limited. When he heard his grandfather's words, he was somewhat unconvinced. Isn't that the case? That Flick and his 2 undead creatures are at most just 3 legendary powerhouses. We have so many legendary powerhouses, can't they deal with them? Heath, you underestimate the Tower of Dusk, but you're not entirely to blame. You just need to know that the Tower of Dusk managed to get to where they are today not because of luck. Seeing how puzzled Charles looked, Claus smiled and shook his head. He continued, I bet you've only been paying attention to that Flick right from the beginning, "Ha, didn't you notice the mages of the Tower of Dusk? What kind of power can a group composed of nearly 100 archmages exert? Since you have been the patriarch of the Dida family for 2 years, you should be able to imagine it. No matter how many archmages there may be, they still aren't legendary mages. Besides, we have a team of mages too." Charles grumbled in a disgruntled manner. "Well, let's not talk about the mages from the Tower of Dusk being on par with ours. Let's just talk about the legendary powerhouses that you keep mentioning. That Fulik is a few years younger than you, and is now a legendary mage. You might think that he has just entered the legendary realm for less than 2 years, and isn't a big deal." At this point Claus could not help but sigh deep down. The young mage of the Tower of Dusk was a complete monster. He stepped into the legendary realm before the age of 20, which was an unprecedented feat in Anral. However, Charles still found Claus' high opinion of Lin Li unacceptable. He could not help but ask, "Isn't it? Even if he entered the legendary realm early, it's only been a little more than 2 years since then. How powerful can he get within such a short period of time?" "I must tell you that you are wrong to think so, and you're actually very wrong. Haven't you heard of the conflict between the Tower of Dusk and the Darkblade? Can an ordinary legendary mage defeat 2 legendary powerhouses who had been famous for a long time?" And now, Claus said a few words to Charles, but when he said that, his brows furrowed. At the thought of how he felt when he met Lin Li, he couldn't be sure if he was hallucinating or not, but he faintly felt the aura of the sanctuary realm. What's going on now? That lowly Darkblade can't prove how powerful he is. Besides, there are 6 big families and a dozen legendary powerhouses on our side. Do we still need to be afraid of him? Charles obviously did not agree with his grandfather. He looked down on the Darkblade, which had been known as the leader of the top 10 bandit groups of the Breezy Plains. In fact, they had not even qualified to participate in the meet at Grand Town. It was far from the top forces, like the Mithril Alliance and the Caesar family. Hearing what his grandson said, Claus shook his head, temporarily cast aside his doubts, and continued, "Now, it's not easy to deal with that Fulik alone, let alone with the others around him. He has more than just 2 legendary undead servants. That human who looks like a high elf in his team may not have strong mana waves, but he makes me feel a sense of danger." Upon hearing Claus' words, Charles' expression changed. After all, he wasn't clueless about everything. He felt that if the other party could make his grandfather feel a sense of danger, he had to be about the same level as his grandfather. For the ones below the legendary realm, the gaps between levels were not very obvious, and it was not uncommon for level 17 archmages to kill level 18 or level 19 archmages. However, in the legendary realm, every difference in level would be a huge gap, unless the mage had very powerful magic equipment or other tools for assistance. However, that was not all. Claus continued to say to Charles, "Besides, did you notice that goblin from the Tower of Dusk's team? The goblins have disappeared from the mainland for countless years. I really don't know where the Tower of Dusk found that goblin. It doesn't matter if you don't know about goblins. However, you have to know that the presence of the goblin often means the existence of an alchemy colossus. The goblins are true alchemy masters, who manipulate and control the alchemy colossuses. The alchemy colossuses that they create are not the inferior ones created in Rotterdam. They have at least legendary level combat power. Isn't it just a little dwarf? Is it that exaggerated?" Charles clearly didn't believe it. The hideous dwarf did not have any mana fluctuations, yet it could still have legendary level combat power. Claus was not upset about Charles' doubts. He said, "Maybe you don't understand what kind of strength they have. We have heard before that the Tower of Dusk found the Retribution Knight Rodhart, who ravaged the Breezy Plains hundreds of years ago, in the Dragon Mountains recently." "Impossible. Hasn't the Retribution Knight already been purified by the Prophet Willen of the Brilliant Shrine?" Charles shrieked in shock before Claus even said anything more. Claus shook his head, and said, "We have already verified the piece of news. Although the Retribution Knight had been seriously injured by Willen, he still had sanctuary level power, and he had nearly 100 Death Knights around him. Regardless of the means used by the Tower of Dusk, the result is that the Retribution Knight was annihilated. That person who looks like a high elf is holding a weapon which is the Eternal Frost Blade that belonged to the Retribution Knight back then. This doesn't necessarily prove how powerful they are." Charles was no longer as confident after hearing his grandpa's explanation. "That's not all. To my surprise, the person standing next to Fulik, Basil, who's a hermit from Duland, had actually joined the Tower of Dusk. Although Basil had never made any amazing achievements in his life, I can tell from previous observations that I won't be confident in dealing with him. Therefore, even if the Glitter Gold Trade Union chooses to stay out of the matter, we will have to pay a great price if we want to eliminate the Tower of Dusk. Think about who will really benefit in the end when that happens." When Claus was describing the power of the Tower of Dusk to Charles, he was actually more and more frightened. The Tower of Dusk appeared in the breezy plains less than 3 years ago, and Claus had to admit that the young President Fulik was really good at creating miracles. But they obviously have the same agenda as we now. They are also going to explore the ruins in the depths of the canyon. Do you want to watch them share the treasures in the ruins with us? Charles said indignantly. Don't worry, the time just isn't ripe yet. We still have a long way ahead. We'll definitely get the chance. Claus naturally did not feel good about Lin Li, who had ruined his plan. Not to mention the fact that it concerned the ruins of the High Elves. No one would be willing to see the huge wealth that they were about to acquire being shared with others. At this moment, someone outside the tent reported, Master Patriarch, Master Joseph of the Mithril Alliance would like to invite you to the discussion. Remember, the time is not ripe yet. Joseph has a greater feud with the Tower of Dusk than you do, Claus said, giving Charles the last reminder. He then lifted the tent's flap and walked out. Looking at the dangling curtains, Charles fell deep into thought. The open ground in the canyon was extremely quiet at the moment. The camps of the two expedition teams were not very far apart due to the limitations of the terrain. Hence, they were all keeping their guard up. As for the Glitter Gold Trade Union and the Tower of Dusk, the senior executives gathered in one tent with solemn expressions, which caused tension to build up in the tent. No one thought that they would encounter the Mithril Alliance and the Caesar family there. However, they were certain that the other party had the same goal as them. Although no one could make up for the fact that the news had been leaked, none of them wanted to have a competitor lurking around them in the face of the potential dangers that could exist in the High Elves' ruins. It's a pity that the expedition team of the Mithril Alliance and the Caesar family is here. If they did not get the news from someone else, we might be the source of the clue that they have. There was an unusually solemn expression on Hoffman's chubby face, which was usually graced with a smile. Regarding this exploration, only me and my undead servants knew about it before we arrived. Master Basil, too, has only arrived 2 days before the team set off. Lin Li had already thought about it a long time ago. It would be impossible for the news to leak from the Tower of Dusk, unless he mentioned it in his dreams, or his undead servants betrayed him. Hoffman looked at the people on his side and shook his head slightly. With a look of puzzlement, he said, in the Glitter Gold Trade Union, only Master Thomas and I knew about this matter. Jeremy and Elvin only found out after the team set off. Even the two surviving members of the previous expedition never knew what those clues that they found meant. If the reason was that the Tower of Dusk and Glitter Gold Trade Union's team had attracted the attention of the Mithril Alliance and the Caesar family when they headed to the Gargus Canyon, it wouldn't seem to explain the problem at this time. After all, the other party obviously wanted to beat them in entering the canyon. They also required time to prepare. The fact that they were well prepared made it seem impossible for their choice to enter the canyon to seem like a last-minute one. After analyzing the possibilities, the senior executives of both parties still couldn't figure out how the news got leaked, unless they had gotten the clues from other channels. Although that was also possible, it wasn't a convincing explanation. After all, the Glitter Gold Trade Union got the news by chance. If it were not for the previous expedition team, which brought the clues back, no one would believe that there would be High Elven ruins in the Gargus Canyon. After some discussion, they still did not get the desired result. The Glitter Gold Trade Union and the Tower of Dusk could only temporarily put that issue aside. After all, it was more important to deal with the Mithril Alliance and Caesar family at the moment. Hoffman and Lin Li had the same idea as Joseph in terms of dealing with the competitors. At least for now, the two parties should not get into an obvious conflict. The difference in strength between the two parties was not that great. Even if they had a certain advantage, they would not have enough power to explore the ruins after fighting. As for the exploration of the ruins, both parties should rely on their own abilities. Since they had an advantage, they could be confident, especially because the Glitter Gold Trade Union started off as archaeologists. After getting some rest, the team of the Tower of Dusk and the Glitter Gold Trade Union packed up and began to move toward the depths of the huge canyon. Seeing that the situation was amiss, the Mithril Alliance and the Caesar family packed up at the same time and went ahead together with their competitors. Although the two teams did not give in to each other, they had a tacit understanding and maintained a peaceful interaction. Everyone knew that the two parties could never cooperate, but they would not deliberately interfere with each other's plans. There seemed to be an invisible wall between the two teams. Although they both had the same goal, they were doing their own things silently. Although some tyrannical monsters that grew up in the environment appeared along the way, that did not have any impact on the two powerful teams at all. Be it Lin Li's or Joseph's team, their weakest member was still a level 15 powerhouse. Even the legendary level magical beasts would not be able to stop them in their tracks. As the team delved deeper, some things were finally unearthed, such as broken sculptures, stone tables with blurred carvings, and other unidentified fragments. Since both teams had been advancing alongside each other, They each occupied an area, and did not interfere with each other. Whenever Lin Li and Hoffman found something, the people from their team would exclaim from time to time. Obviously, the other party also found some extraordinary items. However, after discussing how to get along with each other, Hoffman and Lin Li did not have their mood affected, and they focused on their own discoveries instead. Master Falik, Master Basil, please take a look at this stone tablet. The inscription on the stone tablets might have become blurry, but it's obvious that only the royal high elves had the right to use it. Pointing at the halves of the stone tablets, Hoffman could not hide his joy at all. Although they could make some speculations from the items that the expedition team had brought back, and guessed that they had something to do with the high elves, they were, after all, just fragments of a magical accessory. It was not impossible for them to have been left behind by a high elven craftsman, or originate from a private collection of the relics of the high elves. However, the stone tablet before them was a majestic one, with inscriptions that only the royal high elves could use. If the ruins had belonged to ordinary high elves, they would probably have been completely erased by the real royals. As more and more things were discovered, there was also more and more evidence to link the ruins to the royal high elves. However, in addition to the excitement, everyone began to look more and more solemn. If the ruins really belonged to the royals of the high elves, it would mean that the danger of the real ruins was definitely extraordinary. In the Dark Age, the royal high elves were absolutely standing on the top of the world. Their royal bloodline allowed them to possess unrivaled strength without much effort. Besides, their royal status made them superior, and no one could compare to them except for the High Elven Queen. Even the High Lord Osric could not. Although the number of royal families amongst the High Elves was small, they enjoyed most of the resources of the entire world. They liked having the extremes of everything. They lived in the most luxurious palaces, used the most exquisite objects, appreciated the best art, and also guarded everything they had with the most powerful force at the same time. Although almost no one dared to offend the royals of the High Elves at that time, let alone break into their palaces, holding greater power to guard everything was more of an indispensable status symbol. Although not all royal families had the inheritance of the immortal king, like Osric and peak-level accomplishments in all fields, the top talents of all fields would work for them as long as they issued an order. Legend had it that even Osric couldn't refuse their invitation sometimes. Every palace of the royal high elves could be considered an assembly of peak-level masterpieces of various fields. They had guru-level alchemy arrays, guru-level magic traps, and guru-level magic gears. It was hard to imagine how terrifying their protective measures would be. The Glitter Gold Trade Union had long started with the excavation of ruins, but it was their first time activating such huge manpower, and also their first time exploring the ruins of the High Elven Royals. It was precisely because of that although none of the things found by the expedition team had any practical value, they did not give up continuing to explore the area. They, too, did not rush to explore the deeper areas of the canyon immediately. They wanted to get more clues, and it would be best to be able to determine the true owner of the ruins, which would likely provide them with great convenience when delving deeper. The other party's team seemed to have the same idea. Everyone split up and searched the ground inch by inch, as if they had spread their net open. They were very careful, and did not miss any clues. Lin Li and the rest did not know what they found, but they knew that there were definitely archaeological experts, who were knowledgeable about the High Elves' culture in their team. Although they were careful, they were still advancing slowly during the search. They turned over almost all of the land behind them, causing it to seem like a farming field. Fortunately, they were all powerhouses above level 15. Weaker people might not be able to dig through the ground that had been frozen for tens of thousands of years. When Lin Li was talking to Basil about a piece of stone that he was holding, a mage from the Tower of Dusk suddenly walked over quickly, holding a stick-like object that was stained with mud in his hand. "President, we just found this thing over there, but it doesn't seem to be a magic staff. There are no magical waves on it," the mage said while handing the stick-like object over. From the beginning of the exploration, they had been discovering debris, fragments, and broken statues. It was the first object that seemed to be complete. Lin Li couldn't help but be curious. He grabbed the item from the mage and directly cast Earth Escape, which immediately cleared the dirt from the item, revealing its true appearance. "This looks familiar." Lin Li looked at the object in his hand. It was a scepter that was carved out of some type of stone, and there were exquisite patterns carved on it. There was also an ornament on top that was in the shape of the Tree of Eternity, which came with a stone sphere on its crown. Lin Li could tell from the shape that it should have been some staff, but it would be impossible to carve a scepter out of stone. However, the Tree of Eternity ornament had proven that the ruins were owned by a royal. Basil took a look at the spot beside him, and pondered for a moment before saying, "I remember seeing something similar mentioned in a document that recorded the etiquette of the High Elves. This should be for sacrificial offerings, I suppose." "No, their utensils for memorials. After being reminded by Basil, Lin Li also suddenly remembered that he had indeed seen something similar to the stone staff in his hand when he was in Osric's mausoleum. However, the ornamentation on the top of the stone scepter in Osric's mausoleum was not in the shape of the Tree of Eternity, but the branches and leaves of the Tree of Eternity. It was neatly placed in the square in front of the mausoleum's entrance. So, this ruin is probably the mausoleum of the High Elven royals. Right. Lin Li looked at the stone scepter in his hand for a while before proceeding to the area searched by the Glitter Gold Trade Union together with Basil. They found Hoffman, who was trying to identify some fragment. President Flick, what did you discover? Hoffman asked. He had already seen the stone scepter in Lin Li's hand. He suddenly widened his eyes that had already been narrowed into slits. They gleamed with excitement, and he said, Did you just discover this? Is it a scepter used by the High Elves during memorial ceremonies? Hoffman's exclamation immediately attracted several other senior executives of the Glitter Gold Trade Union. Thomas was also a knowledgeable mage, hence, he confirmed the use of the stone-carved scepter. At this moment, everyone was a little bit overwhelmed with excitement. If it weren't for the presence of the Mithril Alliance's and Caesar family's team, they would have rejoiced and cheered immediately. Since it was a scepter used in memorial ceremonies, the ruins in the canyon were likely to be the mausoleum of the royals of the High Elves. A mausoleum was rather different from ordinary ruins. If it were just a palace, the contents would probably have been removed by the High Elves at the end of the Dark Age, leaving behind just deadly traps. However, mausoleums would be different. Even if the High Elves were in desperation, they wouldn't dig the mausoleums of their predecessors, especially those of the royals. During the era when the High Elves ruled Anril, the royals could be considered to have been supported by all the races they ruled over, and occupied almost all the wealth of the entire mainland. Osric's massive wealth was accumulated by his efforts in commanding the Magic Legion. However, the royal High Elves almost didn't have to do anything to enjoy the great wealth created by the race. The High Elves were extremely enthusiastic about burial rituals, especially the royal families that were at the top of the entire hierarchy. They demanded everything of theirs to be at the extremes, hence, the burial objects in their mausoleums were often surprisingly luxurious. The treasure vaults belonging to humans now probably could not compare to them. Rumor had it that shortly after the end of the Dark Age, the rebels had unearthed a mausoleum belonging to a High Elven royal, and the luxury of it was completely beyond Evrion's imagination. The dome of the mausoleum that served as the sky was made of magical crystals, and was embellished with countless superior magical gemstones. There were sanctuary realm dragon crystals that hung on both sides of the dome, radiating light like the sun and the moon. There was fine sand that was made of ground up magical metals piled up into peaks and paving the ground. Countless legendary magical crystals of various colors flowed in the river. A random grab in the water would bring about valuable treasures. However, in addition to the precious magical materials, the most precious items among the burial objects of the High Elves were the magical objects that had been created with the top skills of every field. There was a variety of powerful magical weapons, gorgeous suits of armor and robes inscribed with complex mageths, and exquisite magical accessories that contained amazing power, all of which were peak guru-level masterpieces. Even the most common works of art displayed in the mausoleum contained amazing powers that would drive anyone crazy. Therefore, when the appearance of the stone scepter hinted to everyone that the ruins they were exploring were probably the mausoleum of the royal High Elves, almost no one could keep calm. As the president of the Glitter Gold Trade Union, Hoffman had an astonishing amount of wealth, but he was still blushing at this moment, and was a little out of breath. Not to mention other people, even Master Thomas, who was the most stable, could not hide the enthusiasm in his eyes. The people of the Tower of Dusk were also quite excited. Basil, who was known as the Hermit of Dulan's City, Conorus, who was a self-proclaimed deity, and Angelano, who was originally reluctant to come along on the expedition, were just as agitated as the people from the Glitter Gold Trade Union. In the face of the mausoleum of the High Elven royals, no one could keep calm. Even if they had explored the Sky Castle and Osric's mausoleum, they could not contain their excitement. However, Lin Li had experienced all sorts of major occasions, and apart from being excited, he couldn't help but think of another problem. If it were the ruins of a palace, there would definitely be all kinds of top-level protective and defensive measures. However, there would definitely be shortcuts available. After all, the royal family still had to live in the palace, and it would be impossible to make the entrances and exits too complicated. However, a mausoleum was different. One would not expect to come out again after entering. Some would even trap their craftsmen in the mausoleums as burial objects. Given the importance of mausoleums to the High Elves, especially the royals, their protective measures were definitely the best. At the same time that Lin Li was guessing that the ruin might be a mausoleum, he couldn't help but think of the fact that the expedition team had been attacked by a large number of undead creatures outside the huge canyon for no obvious reason. He wondered if there was a link between the two. Regardless, everyone finally regained their composure and peace after a while, and they were more careful about the exploration and excavation. Everyone knew that since they were in the mausoleum of the High Elven Royals, in addition to the massive wealth that they might unearth, the danger they might face could be 10,000 times higher than that in ordinary ruins. It seems that we can't enter this ruin easily. Even sanctuary powerhouses would probably suffer losses if they were to barge into the mausoleum of the High Elves in an unruly manner. Hoffman looked away from the huge canyon and said to the senior executives of the two forces beside him, "It will be best if we can verify the identity of the owner of the mausoleum. That way, if we're lucky, we might be able to get a little more insurance." Although Hoffman's idea was good, things didn't always go according to plan in reality. After exploring for about half a day, they unearthed many objects, but there were only a few that could really provide useful information. More than a dozen similar stone scepters were unearthed. Some were intact, but some were broken. However, those alone could not prove the identity of the owner of the mausoleum. "President Hoffman, have you ever heard of Davos?" Lin Li asked all of a sudden. "Davos? Are you referring to the academic master Davos? He's the most authoritative archaeologist in the entire Felon Kingdom. How could I not have heard of him? However, it is said that he has been missing for more than 20 years. Otherwise, I would definitely invite him along this time." Hoffman was a little surprised at first, but he seemed to have thought of something, and then asked Lin Li, "Do you know him, Master Flick?" I don't know him very well, but Master Basil is very familiar with him. If you don't mind, Master Basil can invite him here to take a look," Lin Li said smilingly. After all, the operation this time was a cooperation between the Tower of Dusk and the Glitter Gold Trade Union. The piece of news was provided by the Glitter Gold Trade Union. Hence, in order to avoid letting the information leak from his side, Lin Li had not asked Basil to invite Davos to participate in the expedition. However, now that the Mithril Alliances and the Caesar family's team had arrived, it wasn't too necessary to keep it a secret. Still, out of respect, Lin Li still had to seek Hoffman's opinion first. "Really? That's great. Davos is an expert and an authoritative figure in the field of archaeology. If we can invite him here, maybe we'll be able to find some clues." Hoffman was surprised when he heard Lin Li's words. Although there was no shortage of archaeological experts in the expedition team this time, and Hoffman could also be considered an authoritative and prestigious archaeologist, everyone saw things from a different perspective. Perhaps Master Davos might have some unique insights. After Basil and Davos returned from exploring the Arctic areas, Basil returned to Duland in consideration of the agreement he had made with Lin Li. Meanwhile, Davos might have fallen in love with living with the dwarves, or still had some thoughts about the ruins. Hence, he chose to stay with the tribe. The dwarven tribe was not that far away from Gargus Canyon, and as a legendary mage, Basil could totally fly back and forth using his power of flight. However, it was naturally impossible for Lin Li to make Basil fly over while carrying Davos. Hence, he summoned the Crimson Dragon from his summoning lamp, and got Basil to ride it to Davos and pick him up. The Crimson Dragon itself was a tyrant in the sky, and it had more advantages than the power of flight in terms of directions and navigation. In about half a day, the Crimson Dragon reappeared in the sky above the expedition, flapping its fleshy wings and slowly descending. After the Crimson Dragon landed, Basil jumped off the dragon's back together with a bearded middle-aged man who was dressed in a robe made of animal hide. Is this Master Davos?" Hoffman asked Lin Li softly. He couldn't believe his eyes at all. Seeing the middle-aged man looking around with excitement while following Basil, Lin Li couldn't help but nod with a wry smile and say, "I think you're right. Master Basil once said that Master Davos has been living in a dwarven tribe for more than 20 years. He seems to have already groomed himself before coming." "Hoffman, Flick, this is Master Davos," Basil introduced briefly as he led Davos to Lin Li and Hoffman. Upon hearing Basil's introduction, Hoffman finally put away his doubts and greeted Davos enthusiastically. "Master Davos, there was no news from you for more than 20 years, and everyone thought that you had gotten into an accident. I didn't expect to see you again. It's a great honor for me." "Oh, hello. Didn't you say that you have found something? Show it to me. Hurry." Davos was indeed an authoritative figure in the field of archaeology. He was almost obsessed with archaeology, and he completely ignored the fact that Hoffman was the president of the Glitter Gold Trade Union. He simply answered him perfunctorily, and then eagerly asked to take a look at the item that they had discovered. Hoffman was not angry with Davos' perfunctory attitude, and courteously said, "Master Davos, please come here. The items we have discovered lately are all placed here." Hoffman gestured for Davos to follow him to the place where the relics were placed. After seeing the objects that had been unearthed, Davos' eyes lit up immediately, and he looked like a hungry tiger, that had just seen its prey. He picked up the objects and observed them carefully. He was engrossed in scrutinizing them, and it was as if everyone around him had disappeared at this moment. Master Davos, we reckon that this ruin was probably owned by a royal family of the High Elves. In order to ensure more safety in our future explorations, we hope to verify the real owner of the mausoleum using the objects that we have unearthed. Hoffman explained the purpose of inviting Davos as he followed him carefully. Yes, it is indeed a relic of a high elven royal family. Did you mention that this is a mausoleum? Davos put down the stone in his hand, picked up the stone scepter that was placed near him, and said, "It's because you found this, isn't it?" The ritual objects used by the High Elves during memorials are symbols of the owner's status when he was alive. However, now that you have found this, do you still not know who the owner is? Hoffman's face was flushed, and he could not help but think to himself, if we'd already verified the identity of the owner of the mausoleum, would we still have had to invite you here? However, he had also deduced something from Davos' words. It seemed that the identity of the owner of the mausoleum had something to do with the stone scepter. Davos straightened his body and looked at Hoffman and the others who had followed him. He then pointed at the ornamentation on the top of the stone scepter, and said, "The High Elves have a strong concept of hierarchy. This is not just reflected in the major aspects, but also in the trivial matters and issues. Take this stone scepter as an example. The Tree of Eternity ornamentation can only be used by the royals. However, there are also differences in status between royal families. The difference in number of branches and leaves on the Tree of Eternity ornamentation signifies a difference in status. You can tell from the stone scepter." So the owner of this mausoleum. Hoffman did not expect such a simple carving to be so detailed. Davos glanced at Hoffman and sternly said, "Take one scepter and count the number of leaves and branches." The Tree of Eternity carving on this stone scepter has 13 main branches and 37 leaves, which symbolize the 13 surnames of the High Elves and the 37 nobles. Such a pattern status of the master of the mausoleum is only one level below that of the High Elven Queen. In the history of the High Elves, there had always been very few royal families, and it was rare for any of them to have such a high status. So, could it be the High Elven Queen's younger brother, Prince Berhir? Asked Hoffman, who had, after all, studied and researched the history of the High Elves. After hearing Davos' clear hint, a name suddenly came to his mind. "Well, it seems that you have done a good job studying the history of the High Elves, President Hoffman. In the history of the High Elves, only Berhir, the younger brother of the High Elven Queen, can hold such a position." Davos nodded and put the stone scepter back in place. As for the others, they couldn't help but gasp after hearing the name mentioned by Hoffman. Understanding history was the most basic requirement for archaeologists. The people who were present might not have superhuman accomplishments in archaeology, but with their historical knowledge, they definitely knew about Berhir. In the era when the High Elves ruled Anral, the High Elven Queen was the most powerful, followed by her younger brother Prince Berhir. He was truly above everyone else. In the entire history of the High Elves, no one except Prince Berhir could hold such a prominent position. It was said that the areas that Prince Berhir was in charge of back then included the Dwarf Kingdoms and the Orc Kingdoms. However, unlike other High Elven lords, Prince Berhir was not very keen on ruling. He basically ignored everything that happened in his territory and focused all his energy on painting, sculpting, music, and other fields of art. He had extremely high attainments in various fields. In the era that was named after darkness, Prince Berhir's indifferent way of ruling was undoubtedly quite unusual compared to other High Elven lords. Life for the various races under his rule was just like in paradise compared to other regions, for the rules were less harsh. When dealing with the dwarves, he did not even station any army in the Dwarf Kingdom, and simply allowed them to live and develop freely in the Arctic snowfield. Some people even said that if it weren't for Berhir's death, the dwarves would probably not join the rebellion forces. Unlike the High Lord Osric, who created history with the lives and blood of the other races, most of the historical events involving Prince Berhir revolved around achievements in the field of art. Even now, there were still many of his artworks, such as poems and music, that were widely circulated in Anral. The people did not resent Prince Berhir like they resented other High Elves. However, just because Berhir devoted all his energy to art, it did not mean that he was a weak person who needed to rely on others to protect him. His noble blood allowed him to effortlessly reach a height that ordinary people could not. Legend had it that Berhir had gone into the Endless Abyss more than once in search of creative inspiration. It could be seen from the works about the Endless Abyss that he had created that he had a better understanding of it than the High Lord Osric. They had basically determined that the owner of the mausoleum was Prince Berhir, who had a history of high attainments in art. The massive machinery of the Glitter Gold Trade Union immediately spread the information. The Glitter Gold Trade Union had indeed started off as excavators of ruins. It only took 3 days for the legendary assassinja to return with a massive load of information. In the tents of the makeshift camp, the senior executives of the Glitter Gold Trade Union and Tower of Dusk sat around the table, on which there was a thick pile of materials. The most conspicuous one was singled out, and there were a few drawings that seemed to be torn. The drawings were acquired from a dwarf by the Glitter Gold Trade Union. Although torn and obviously incomplete, everyone could tell that it was a sketch of a mausoleum.
Thank you for watching Mystic Realms Recap. Please like, share and subscribe. Have a great day.